For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel.
Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Kelby, and thank our listeners for joining us tonight for Connecting the Dots. And tonight I have a Christian minister by the name of Matthew Cummings that I met last summer in a friend's home in southwest Montana. And Matthew has an incredibly interesting story to tell, and he has an incredibly interesting perspective on not only the spiritual climate of America today, but also how the political climate is being used to destroy Christianity in the United States and to change the way we see the world and the way we see one another. And just to let our listeners know, Matthew is a black minister. He has a congregation in Colville, Washington. And Matthew is going to be a speaker on our panel at the Red Pill Expo. He's going to be on a panel called All Lives Matter. We are sick and tired of all the racism and all the drum beating to try to make people distrust and dislike one another on something as stupid as race. And we are standing up as true patriotic Americans who believe that our country is based on our differences, but we all need to be working together to make sure that this nation survives as a free constitutional republic. And the forces that are aligned against us, even though they talk a great line about how they are trying to point out all the problems with America and straighten them out, what they're doing is trying to create divides between races, between cultures, between people, and exploit those divides in a way that destroys our republic. Matthew, I welcome you to the show. I really enjoyed our conversation that we had last summer in Montana, and I would like to share with our listeners all the information that you have to give our listeners. And so I will start this by saying I thank you for being one of the people speaking on behalf of Christians of all colors and nationalities that recognize the miracle known as America. Welcome to the show. And Matthew, please tell our listeners a little about yourself, and then we'll get into the discussion of your childhood early in Detroit.
And Mr. Happel, I don't see him on the board at this point.
No, we might have lost him. I will continue to speak. Hopefully, we can get him back up because his message is absolutely phenomenal. I think it's very important that we hear what this gentleman has to say because he grew up in the midst of a really unique time frame in America where the school systems were being literally manipulated to create a whole different culture than what our traditional American culture is based on. I will, Kelby, I am going to try to get back in contact Matthew and see if we can get him back on the call.
Not a problem. I'll keep everybody at bay for you and help help people to understand modern-day Christianity in the United States of America, if you want to go ahead and do that in the background.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. One of the things that a lot of people and a lot of pastors are really working towards striving to teach is the anti-segregation of church and state, because a lot of them don't understand. A lot of them think because they in fact have become a 501c3 church, and the governing officials say that you can't talk hate, meaning you can't speak about one Democratic party or one Republican party, or you can't talk about homosexuality, or you can't talk about these things, and or because of that line that's been drawn with the elements of the separation of church and state, which is originally from a letter from Thomas Jefferson, where he was just simply writing a letter to an individual, and it was more for the protections of that individual and their rights to practice any religion that they want. And so, in backgrounding it, are you back, Daniel?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Kelby. I don't want to interrupt if you're in the middle of something fairly deep.
I was just, give me about a minute or what have you. I'll be just done with this short introduction on the truth about the separation of church and state, which I'm sure this pastor would love to go into as well.
Oh, he would love to.
Yeah, but the bottom line is Thomas Jefferson had zero intention to keep the church out of the state. As a matter of fact, I personally invested my time to look into the law, and I found that there was a law written by Congress and passed that the Capitol building would be used, in fact, for church services. So, during that time, in the beginning stages of our great country, America, between 1776 and 1801, not only were they having church service in the Capitol building, but they in fact made it a law. So I don't think it was ever the intention, if you are the ACLU or you some anti-church or anti-prayer in public school. I think there's been a complete shift and mindset shift of, unfortunately, the United States citizens, that they do not, in fact, understand that that's not the principles of what our country was founded on, and we did enjoy worshiping of our God in public venues such as school, in the Capitol building, and so forth. That's it, Daniel. I'll yield the floor back to you. All right, so I'm going to keep going. So the point, I love to make that story correct for people and getting their mind straightened out. And as a matter of fact, if anybody has any interest on the work that was done so they can share it with their pastors, we'd be more than happy to. You can simply send an email to RRB or send it to admin@republicoftheunitedstates.org, and we'll be more than happy to respond with the information pertaining to the separation of church and state and the factual data that's behind it. Our country and our laws do not support it. As a matter of fact, Public Law 97-280 under Ronald Reagan in 1984 says the Bible is in fact the Word of God, and your obedience to it means you're obeying federal law, which has been a complete shift during the last couple of administrations, not so much this administration, but they're very much looking forward to incorporating back, hopefully, into the schools prayer, and really what this country needs is a God-supporting body politic of people and a people supporting their nation with God. And that's something that our nation was, in fact, founded on, written deep into the laws by our Congress. And media now, of course, doing everything that they can to distort the truth of the intention of our founders. And it's one of the exciting things that we have in law that a lot of people don't know about. Are you back, Dan? I think he's still out there, Don.
No, I'm back. Yep.
There you go. I yield.
Okay, thank you. I want to get Matthew into the discussion. Matthew, I don't know if you heard the introduction that I gave for you, but I mentioned that you are a gentleman, a black minister, who is trying to put an end to all the silly, divisive, nasty things that have been going on in this country to try to divide us by race, by culture, by virtually every measure that they can to destroy our constitutional republic. And I mentioned the fact that you started out as a young student in Detroit with an experiment called a Children's Community School. And I would love to have you introduce yourself to our listeners, and then let's talk about the Children's Community School.
I don't know if you conferenced him on. He's having trouble getting on, Dan.
Uh-oh. Okay. I know he when I called him, he said he had tried 2 different phones and he was having trouble with both phones.
Well, do me a favor. Do me a favor. Send me a text of that man's phone number, and I'll conference him in for us right now.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. This is kind of the road show for this evening, but I do find it interesting that we have the disparity of pastors across the country that do not have the general knowledge of what our founders gave us. And unfortunately, I also find it interesting that many of them have given their churches over to the state as a registered entity to allow for the state to control many of the things in which they are allowed to or not to say, under the aspect that they will take away their ability to preach under a 501c3 unless they preach certain things or elements. And this country, under previous administrations, was moving drastically and quickly towards controlling the speech of the church of our country, America. So it's one of the things to consider as we are turning our hearts back to God and developing that back into our nation and the founding principles of our nation, that we understand the truth of what our founders gave us, and we understand the truth of you really shouldn't even allow the state to get between your entity and God, and allowing the state to govern what you are, in fact, allowed to say or not say. Get in there, folks.
Okay, Kelby, I'm back on.
All right, I got it. I'm gonna work on it.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry. We don't have usually these kind of problems, but that is a problem with doing radio shows that are literally our staff is scattered all over the country. And we do these programs via telephone conference call so that it allows a large number of us to be in every different place in the country and still be able to participate in these calls. So,
Mr. Happel, I am on with us.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, Matthew, welcome to the Connecting the Dots show. And I've done a couple of lead-ins for you. I would like you to introduce yourself to our listeners, and then let's start talking about the Children's Community School that you encountered in Detroit. But first, tell our listeners a little about yourself.
I don't hear anybody speaking.
I'm on, but I'm not getting anything either.
He's got an issue on his phone. It just hung up again. I'm going to get him back on the line. Hold on one sec.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, Pastor Cummins grew up in Detroit, and he was from a single-parent family, and in 1969, his mother enrolled him in a school when he was 7 years old called the Children's Community School. And he has a very interesting background because he was one of the first students in this experimental school that happened to be under the principal of, he was the principal of the school was William Ayers, Bill Ayers, who was later the one of the ringleaders of the Weathermen. And Bill Ayers, Pastor Cummins has a lot of knowledge about how they were changing the
He's back
school
on with
system.
his end.
Okay, good. Matthew, I've been ad-libbing for you here, but to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little about yourself, and then we'll talk about the Children's Community School in Detroit.
He's on with us right now. I have no idea what's going on.
Okay. Matthew, we're having some problems with your phone.
You know what? Let's get him on the participant line. I'll work on getting him on the participant line. See if that's any different. Then I'll unmute him over there, and I'll be right back, guys.
Okay. I'll continue to ad-lib. In any event, Pastor Cummings was a student, a 7-year-old, and he was brought into this school system because his mother believed that it was some kind of a new, really excellent school system that was going to teach young students in an exceptional way and recognize their exceptional abilities. And when the school came into being and they started to understand what the school was all about, it was teaching collectivism and teaching communism, or certainly socialism, and teaching that individualism was bad, that American exceptionalism did not exist, and that America was a country that really had taken advantage of the rest of the world and therefore had to be changed from within. And it was exactly the sort of thing that I think a lot of people learned about Bill Ayers as a tutor of President Obama. And so Matthew's discussion and his telling the story of what happened in the Detroit school system, in the Children's Community School, is an excellent example of how our education system has been morphed into something that was never intended by our founders, and it isn't a recent event. It's been going on for, just in this example, 50 years. And if it's been going on for 50 years, you know it's been going on longer than that. We've had guests on our show who have talked about the programs that were implemented clear back in the 20s, that funding from large foundations had put significant amounts of money into the teachers' colleges to teach collectivism and to merge the United States with the Soviet Union, with Marxism, and do it in a way that was almost seamless. And it's been going on for that long. So it's been 100 years we've been reaping the harvest of allowing socialists to take over our education system. So, and that is that in a nutshell is what tonight's discussion will be about. I am sorry that we're having all these technical problems, but it does happen from time to time. And I know that Matthew Cummings, Pastor Cummings, is very, very interested in making sure that we know that the people that are attacking our Christian heritage and our churches and our schools are all connected, and they are connected in a way that is intent on destroying the American system of government under a constitutional republican form of government and turning us into nothing more than one other country in a global soup of socialist Marxist teachings. So, Matthew, are you on the call yet?
Matthew, you on?
Yes, I'm on.
Ah, wonderful. I love to hear your voice. Let's let you talk instead of me. I've been talking pretty straight here between Kelby and I. We've done a lot of ad lib. Matthew, introduce yourself to our listeners, and then let's start talking with you about the Children's Community School.
Sure. My name is Matthew Cummings. I've been a minister of the gospel for about 28 years, and have found myself in what I would call an unusual time frame of watching our great nation head down a path of left-wing ideology, identity politics, what I would call gender confusion instead of biblically what it means, and am looking forward to working with other constitutional Americans to see things change back to the way our nation was originally intended to be.
Good. Well, Kelby did a really good lead-in on why religion, why specifically the Christian religion was such a central part of our original founding documents. And we'll get into that a little later in the discussion because I know you've got a lot of vision in that regard. But I want you to tell the very interesting story of your early years as an elementary student and as a young child growing up in Detroit and your introduction to the Children's Community School System.
Sure. In 1969, I was about 7 years old, and my mother had been interested in getting me into some type of early education and had been attending the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and was interested in the idea of seeing me progress, even though I was a young boy in education, and had befriended some people from the University of Michigan, their grad program, and that led to meeting of two very controversial subjects. One, of course, was the infamous Bill Ayers, who became my principal of Children's Community School. He was the founder of that, and the other was one of his lovers, the recruiter who recruited me, which was Diane Austin, who was, both of them were involved with the Weatherman Underground. Bill Ayers was one of the original founders, and Diane Austin was one of the bomb makers for the Weatherman Underground. They recruited me in 1969 and had only one interest, and that was to take a young black boy and train him with other young boys in indoctrination into socialism and eventually communism. And everything that is being mentioned today, I heard back in 1969 in an open classroom, which is, as I look back now, what a foreteller of what was coming. For me, it kind of culminated in that school with the first day of class. After being recruited, my teacher, Diane Austin, told all of us, about 32 of us, that we no longer had to listen to our parents, and was very much, very intensive of redirecting our thoughts about religion, America, about the different institutions that are today. Everything was spoken against during those 4 to 6 months that I was in that school, that Children's Community School. And, when I think back that for all of us who had young, impressionable minds, what was said to us, just how we were, as I would say, basically told that America's not good, Christianity is not good, being a patriot was not good, and I do mean they mentioned all that in those classrooms. Just everything that you can think of was actually spoken about during those times.
Okay, and during those classroom sessions that you took part in, the things that you're talking about, the fact that they stated that America was bad and that we were preying on the rest of the world and all these other things that they were indoctrinating into these young people. They were also, one of the things that stood out in my discussions with you and with your mother was that they were also working on convincing the students that everything they did was going to be okay, and that there would be no grades per se, that everybody was going to receive an equal mark, and all these things that were part of openly part of the communist training systems that were going on at the time in the Soviet Union. Tell us about some of those sessions and how they were communicating this stuff in class. I know you said they had you sitting around round tables and you were to be part of a team, and individualism was not to be recognized.
Yeah, one of the main purposes for us being put in the open classroom was indeed to develop team, as you said. But when I look at it, individualism was truly being dismantled in all of the kids. One of the other parts in regard to that was that competition and individual achievement was really not encouraged, but the idea of working together and seeing to it that everyone was considered to be of equal, on equal footing. So when I look back at that, I realize that none of that really was true. That they were in one sense giving a false narrative, because the real goal was to basically to see all of us to be indoctrinated into a Marxist and communist way of thinking. And, once you're able to get young minds, as what was happening there, to a place where, in fact, you've heard before, it takes a community, it takes a village. All that was being mentioned back then. And, I came home from that first day of class, and just the idea of everything that my mom had been teaching outside of that school. I came home, and when I began to give what was being said, the rhetoric, let's just say that the manure hit the fan.
Yeah. Well, I met your mother, and she's quite quite a remarkable lady. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you came home and you reported this stuff, and needless to say, she was not thrilled. But your mother very intelligently started writing down and keeping a catalog of all this information, and over a period of a couple of months, collected a lot of information, and then she got together with some of the other parents, didn't she?
Yes, that's true. I shared that story because, of course, the first thing that should have happened because of how I brought it was, if you remember, I told you, I saw the belt on the wall. And she was looking to tan my little backside, but instead, as you said, got pen and paper and did ask what else, and she did collect and began to fight with other parents who were also very disturbed at what their children were bringing home, and eventually did what any common sense, decent American would do, went and confronted Children's Community School and the leadership in regard to what they were teaching.
Right. And like I say, I met your mother, and she is a very remarkable lady. And the fact that she got together with those other parents, and they started comparing notes, and they went to the actual school board, didn't they, and tried to get things changed? Yep.
Yes, they did. And there were several meetings with Bill Ayers and his staff, and they realized that there was not going to be any change in what was being taught by this left-wing school, and eventually had to part ways. I got taken out of school, several others did. Some teachers quit that had been a part of it. And that idea of open school, of course, was introduced into the full American curriculum. And, you've seen its ugly head being wielded all over the American public school systems. Since then, So.
Right, and they call that a progressive learning system, but in fact it's straight out of John Dewey, and it's been in effect for a long time, but it seems like the 60s generated a lot of radicalism that allowed communists to really stand out in the education system. And now they virtually control the universities, really. I mean, you rarely find a conservative professor in the university system.
Agreed.
Yeah. Matthew, I'm gonna do a quote here, and I want you. I know you've heard this quote before, but this is Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, when he spoke before the UN, and he slammed his shoe on the podium. And this is part of the dialogue. This was part of a dialogue he had with the I believe the agriculture secretary at the time, but this was also part of this UN thing. And it is, quote, "Your children's children will live under communism. You Americans are so gullible. No, you won't accept communism outright, but we'll keep feeding you small doses of socialism until you will finally wake up and find that you already have communism. We won't have to fight you. We'll so weaken your economy until you fall like overripe fruit into our hands," unquote. That's Nikita Khrushchev, 1959. Sure. Obviously, he was foretelling what you experienced firsthand 10 years later.
That's right.
Would you tell us what happened with Diane Otten and Bill Ayers, and how all that education system, how she ended up as a result of following his tutelage, let's say?
Well, as you are aware of, Bill Ayers began to take that very system and with the SDS began to spread that across the campuses all over the country. The Weatherman Underground came. Diane Oughton herself, who had actually grown up, some might say, a Republican, and her family actually was very conservative in Illinois, had become radicalized, and she became, as I've said, one of the main bomb makers for the Weatherman Underground, and which bombed installations and federal installations in New York, Pennsylvania, a number of other places across the country. And Diane herself finally met her end in the 1970 bombing, where a bomb she was doing actually went off while she was preparing it to explode in New York itself. And so there, you know, when you think about all that and just how, you know, people of a brilliant mind and yet are twisted left of center, there is never a good ending, you know, when it comes to radical leftist ideas and communism. And it's always going to end violently, and that's the problem. You know, there has not been what I call a real lesson yet about that. And so Bill Ayers, of course, himself was sought after for those bombings, and eventually, because of his father's ties in with GE and the state of Illinois, was given a pardon, I believe, by I think it's Bill Clinton, or either Carter or Clinton gave him a pardon. And so he never really paid for all the damage he did, and of course kept his tenure at the University of Chicago, and has been a thorn in the side of our great republic ever since, you know. And so, you know, the Oughton family have never really, as I would say, never really got justice for how things went down.
Well,
so that's just too bad.
Matthew, you mentioned the fact that Diane Oughton was a really nice lady, and she felt like she and Bill Ayers, she thought that he was going to marry her, and he kind of played on the romantic thing, and they ended up being lovers, and she was always under the impression he was going to marry her, and in fact, you know, he was just using her, right?
Yep, he sure was. Her and several other, and the lady that he's married to now was one of three other lovers. So Ayers had about 4 lovers altogether during that time, and Diane Oughton was the one that got the short end of the stick. So.
Well, I'll tell you, that is a tragic story, but it does also the fact that he was a mentor, and some say was what do you call it, ghostwriter for President Obama for his books about his father, and teachings were actually Bill Ayers was a ghostwriter on a lot of that, and in fact had a huge and undue influence in some of the education bills that created Common Core. Am I off base on that?
No, you're not. Not at all. In fact, just going back to one thing, and then we'll go into Common Core just for a second, is as most people already know, but I'll just remind them, when Barack Obama was being encouraged to get into politics at the state level in Illinois, Bill Ayers was the first to raise money for him. And so, his hands were in Barack Obama's back pocket all the way to the presidency. It never, it never left. And the subversion of our government today is still there because of what Bill Ayers has done. That's why Barack, which himself is a whole other message, but everything in regard to that is because Bill Ayers stepped in. Common Core, yes, he is one of the main authors of that, as it continues to help dummy down what used to be somewhat of a great educational system.
Mm-hmm.
It's always had its problems, but Common Core just takes it to the next level.
Yeah. Well, my daughter has, my grandson is in school in Ohio, and she told me the other day that he came home and said that the teachers was teaching a history class, said that the Holocaust never happened, and that 3,000 Jews were killed in World War II, not 6 million. And needless to say, my daughter was livid, and my daughter is Native American.
Sure.
And so, we're talking, and this is the thing that really impresses me. Those of us that understand liberty, it doesn't make two hoots what our color or our ethnicity, anything else. It does not matter. We understand what liberty is, and that's how they're trying to pull us apart, is by identification of every single difference that we have, and then trying to pick on it like a sore.
Without question.
Yeah,
without question.
Okay, well, we're going to run out of time before we get to cover everything that I'd like to cover, but I'd like to ask you to talk about, you had mentioned, to me anyway, that you have had several interruptions, you call them divine interruptions in your life, and the spirituality of that and why that's so important. I would like to ask you to talk about the divine interruption that you had in 2008 that led you to get more involved in the political as well as the spiritual, and to kind of explain to our listeners what that was about.
Sure. I'll go back just briefly from 2005 to 2007. I had been traveling. A lot of my ministry in the early days was overseas, and I'd been traveling back overseas and ministering in Europe. And so by 2008, I'd had a number of different meetings in England and France and Switzerland, and I was going to be there actually that whole summer ministering during the election process. When former President Barack Obama had traveled over to Europe during the election cycle, he spoke to crowds of hundreds of thousands of people. And I was in Europe at the time and was getting ready to do a meeting in France. And while I was praying, I felt the Lord kind of tugging on my heart about something. And the next day had 3 meetings, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, Sunday afternoon, in 3 different churches in the middle of France. And in the middle of the last sermon, literally felt God saying to me in my heart that while I was preaching, that America was in trouble, and that I really got in my spirit that Barack Obama was going to win, and that he was not of the Lord, and that America was going down a very nasty and dark path. And while this is all going on, even though I'm speaking, I'm having a heart-to-heart with the creator of the universe. And sometimes people just don't realize God cares so much for America. America is really one of the apples of his eye. And so when the Lord said America's in trouble, I realized, I went, uh-oh, what do you want, Lord? And the Lord said, shut all of your meetings, shut them all down and go home. Because the direction America's going is as France. And France has been atheist for close to 90 years now, and communist. And so the moment the Lord said as France, I understood exactly what that meant. Now, I'll admit to everyone that's listening, I said, why me?
Yeah.
You know, you've got tens of thousands of, I'll say it, black ministers. Why are you talking to me about this? And the Lord said, because when I ask you to do something, you do it. And because you and Barack have something in common, go home.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay. So I called my pastor. At the time, I was under a ministry in Nebraska, and told him that the Lord said, shut every meeting, and that meant a lot of income, and go back home. So I told them, and they didn't understand, and I ended up coming back, and the next step was when I got flown into American airspace and was landing, the Lord said, I want you to go and not just get involved in politics, but I want you to register as an open Republican conservative, because you've been voting conservative, but now it's time for you to be out in the open. And for anyone who knows, for a black person to say that they're a Republican and conservative, that's a death wish.
Yeah.
You know, especially in the black community. But the Lord said it, I did it. And right away, that caused trouble amongst the Christian circles, because I started realizing right then and there that a lot of ministers and a lot of God's people were afraid to touch the subject of politics and righteousness in politics, and that, and that we needed to take a stand, even if it cost us everything.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, and one of the things that you talk about, Matthew, and it's in your writings, but you and I visited about it too, is this identity politics where people are using race or ethnicity or other things to separate people.
That's right.
Rather than realizing that our differences, unlike the left who preach how our differences are wonderful things and then doing everything they can to separate us,
right.
Those of us that believe in our constitutional republic understand that our differences are our strength, but the
Amen.
way that it is our strength is by forgetting our differences, not picking on them and trying to turn them into from a scab to a blemish. Tell us about the path that you've been walking, because I find it just absolutely fascinating, and some of the things that you've been working on.
Well, I'll try to be quick. That directional change shifted and changed everything. I found that a lot of people today was under the impression, understood about our great nation, our constitutional republic. I thought that they really had some kind of understanding. I found that most pastors and ministers and others didn't understand. I found that many people had sold out in regard to taking stances and decisions for righteousness' sake. I found many were intimidated to speak up. And when I say intimidated, I mean all different types of ministers, no matter what race, were afraid to speak the truth and afraid to stand for righteousness. I'm not just talking about biblically, that's enough, but just common sense, you know.
Right.
We're not supposed to be judging, but by the context of character. But, you know, what's being used is that people have truly taken on the idea that, you know, it's better to identify in ethnicity for the just fair share of money itself and not what's right.
Right.
You know, and, you know, just no principles. You know, it's been quite an unusual journey. In fact, my family, I've said this in meetings and political meetings, you know, my family calls me the white sheep of the family, not black sheep.
I love it.
You know,
yeah.
so,
well,
you know,
don't feel bad. They call me the black sheep, so.
Yeah, so us black sheep and white sheep need to hang together.
We do.
And, you know, I've had to separate myself, not because I want to, but I can't sit back and watch people utilize ethnicity or gender against good, God-fearing, common sense Americans. I can't do that anymore, you know. And I can't anymore not listen to pastors who won't take stances, because I do believe, you know, that we're at a crossroads, even though we're blessed with Trump. And we're blessed that Trump's in, and we're blessed that what I call, you know, we've been given a reprieve. So, you know, these are still the days where people need to be very vigilant in keeping their freedoms and not, what I say, not relaxing. It's not the time to relax, you know. It's the time to step up and be counted more. You know, you guys, you know, you don't know me, but I count you my brothers more than I do my own family. Because right now, it's about truth, and it's about standing for righteousness. And many of the things that the left is doing, and others are around, you know, they're just not standing for what's right. You know, they have a vision of America that's not what our founding fathers had in mind. So,
well,
you know.
You mentioned something that's really important for our listeners, and of course you understand this because you understand history. You understand that really prior to and during and just after the Revolutionary War, the black community was very involved in the political process, and in fact, you know, the concept of slavery, even though it got to be a real issue because of all the problems that came about prior to the Civil War, the fact is that most of the founding fathers were very much against slavery. And the only reason that it didn't get dealt with immediately was not because they didn't want to deal with it. It was because they wanted to keep the colonies together to unite them as a republic. And they recognized that slavery, if left to die by its own devices, would do exactly that. And, you know, so, and one of the things that we've run into with identity politics is, you know, the fact that that is not being taught to our kids in school. They're being taught that our founding fathers were all a bunch of white racists that were more than happy and condoned slavery, when in fact that really wasn't the case.
Right. Well, you know, Christianity and a lot of not just God-fearing, but common sense people dropped the ball in the educational system, I do say that, dropped the ball. I'm part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because when we had the opportunity to get our schools in order, we didn't do it. And, you know, with the real push for revisionist history, that's what you were talking about, your daughter, in regard to your, I believe, granddaughter or grandson bringing that across. And, you know, revisionist history, everything in regard to that is just it's a lie. It's not the truth.
Yeah, it's just garbage, and it's propaganda. That's it in a nutshell. You know, the other thing that you mentioned is the fear by the church to deal with a lot of this stuff. We've really come totally 180 degrees away from what the founders envisioned because of 501c3 tax-exempt statuses in the church. And I challenge our churches to say, no more. We're not going to allow the IRS to control what we have to say in the church from the pulpit.
Well, there you go. And you know, I would be brought in as a guest speaker, and it's different denominations with the 8 years in regard to the former president. And I would probably say about the third time I came in, the leadership would come and talk about how we're worried about we're losing our 501c3.
Yep.
You know, because I was speaking truth. And remember, anywhere in Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, which was the former president's backyard, there was a lot of heat in the Midwest in regard to that. And that's where I was doing a lot of messaging through that area to get people to rethink. Black churches, white churches, whatever, you know. Years before I would go and preach, and it was good, but those 8 years, I would say, was probably the hardest because you really had the anti-American and anti-God, anti-Christ president, and anti-Israel, you know, and anti-common sense, you know, just every area. And so, you know, I am looking at now that this is the time while we have a president that is not a politician, praise the Lord, you know, to really do something with taking back our nation and not letting go of what I call, you know, the fuel pump as far as trying to, you know, get people back on the right track. So, anyway.
Well, Matthew, I think if there were a new Black Robe Regiment, you would certainly be one of the leaders of that group, and I very much applaud you in what you're doing. Because we did have a few delays and a few problems getting connected tonight, I would ask if you would be willing to come back and be our guest again at a little later date. I've got pretty much booked up through the end of the month, but see if you would come back, because I think your message is just absolutely right on the money, spot on the money, and our focus should be more on a revitalization of the Christian faith, and in the process of revitalizing that, recognizing that our founding fathers had Christianity at the very, very, very center of their system of government, and it was called natural law. And what we need to do is have enough time to give you a chance to put some flesh on the bones of that. It's been a fascinating discussion. So if you would, please, and I'll call you after the show, but let's see if we can get another time to get you back on. And with that, I know we're running just a few minutes late already. Kelby, I will turn the broadcast back over to you, but thank our listeners for their patience, and we will have Reverend Matthew Cummings on again in the very near future.
Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, sir.
God bless.
Shelby, I'm turning the show back over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. God bless and good night.